Hey World Civilizations, Mr. Lassiter with you, and in this video we're going to continue our look at the Middle East, really from 1980 to present, with a heavy emphasis on American intervention. And then we'll also begin looking at this war on terror. If you notice, it's 1980 to the present, so let's look at some of our video goals and talk about some of the problems we have in assessing this time period in this region. So what were the causes and results of the major wars in the Middle East from 1980 to present? Well, we can look at some of these, but ultimately, for example, the war in Afghanistan is still ongoing, and the war on terror, which the United States carries out mostly through strikes in this region, again, very problematic as that is ongoing. We also want to describe the motives for American intervention from 1990 to present. And again, whereas we know oil is one of the big aspects of this, there are many different motives. And so judging those motives depends on your political party. It depends on who is the president of the U.S. during this time period. It depends on what country we're dealing with. Long-term effects of the 9/11 attacks. We want to look at some of these, but also keep in mind that we're still feeling those effects. And then trying to look together at the difficulties of the war, how we might want to view this modern war of U.S. intervention in the war on terror. It's very difficult to do. So we're going to try to do it justice as we go through this video. And let's start with something that I think we can agree is history. Wars that were taking place in the Middle East. And we're going to start with the Iran-Iraq War. So in 1979, Saddam Hussein comes to power in Iraq. And shortly thereafter, the majority Sunni state of Iraq, led by Saddam Hussein, launches an attack on the majority Shia nation of Iran over territorial disputes. The goal of what Saddam Hussein wanted to do was to topple the new Islamic government of Iran, which, as you learned in your last video, had taken over power from the Shah and put Ayatollah Khomeini in power. And so Saddam Hussein launches this attack, and it's going to be a war that actually carries on for until 1988. The U.S. originally supported Iran with weapons, and the Soviet Union had kind of supported Iraq with weapons for some time. And so, in some sense, this was kind of a proxy war. But in the United States, the support of Iran with weapons became extremely controversial at home when this came out that the U.S. was doing this. The U.S. had been giving Iran weapons for other purposes, for example, like the releasing of hostages and things of that nature in other countries, and then trying to funnel money through Iran to wars in Central America. And so when this comes out, it's a major controversy, and so the United States actually ends up kind of switching the alliance from Iran to Iraq, and starts supporting Iraq against Iran, as the U.S. public basically wanted. Ultimately, this helps to force a ceasefire in 1988. But the long-lasting effects of this war are hostilities not only between Iran and another, though majority Sunni nation, but also it was marked by the use of Iraq's chemical weapons against Iran, against civilians, and even against Iraqi Kurds who were non-Arabic. And so this is the first time, but probably not the last time, that Saddam Hussein will use chemical weapons against his own nation. And that's going to be very important coming down the line. Another war is taking place kind of in Central Asia, Middle Eastern region of Afghanistan, as the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan in order to support a communist regime in that country. And they invade in the late 70s and are going to be mired in war for over a decade. Basically, it was unwinnable. The United States and others were training Afghan rebels, including Osama bin Laden, who was fighting in Afghanistan. And this is going to lead to some differences between the U.S. and Soviet Union. For example, the United States is going to boycott the 1980 Olympics because of the Soviet invasion. But winning war in Afghanistan is tough to win because of the mountainous terrain and basically the home field advantage of that the Afghans maintain. And so the Soviet Union is going to be kind of stuck in this war all the way until the late 80s, when they're forced to kind of leave and just absolutely having not won at all. Sound familiar? American intervention in the Middle East wasn't just limited to weapons. In 1990, the United States launches a war against Iraq. And this was in response to Iraq's invasion of the small Persian Gulf nation of Kuwait, a small oil-producing nation. And they had invaded to take over the oil fields there. The United States decided to back Kuwait, and so they launched Operation Desert Storm, basically a highly advanced military operation which drives Iraq out of Kuwait, and it showcased the capability of the U.S. military. And this actually was pretty remarkable because the U.S. military hadn't had kind of a major forceful victory that the whole country could get behind since before Vietnam, and so this was decisive. It pushed Iraq out of Kuwait. It was short, which was important, but the United States decided not to invade Iraq. They thought that after the loss that Iraqis might overthrow Saddam Hussein, but that does not happen. Saddam Hussein manages to keep his stronghold on power. And so this is going to be kind of important because this war is fought while President George H.W. Bush is president, the father of the second George Bush, who will eventually invade Iraq and remove Saddam Hussein from power. Now let's shift over and look at this war on terror and Osama bin Laden. He was originally from a rich Saudi family. He joined the war in Afghanistan against the USSR. He received CIA training while there. In 1988, in order to drive out foreign influences, eliminate the quote-unquote infidels, and several other things, Osama bin Laden creates the organization known as Al-Qaeda. And this will become the kind of greatest terrorist threat to the U.S. and the world. And so with this organization, over the next 20 years or so, Al-Qaeda would carry out some of the most devastating attacks the world has seen. Their first attack was in 1992, which was an attack on hotels in Yemen. And these attacks continued in 1993 with the World Trade Center bombing, separate from the attacks on September 11th. This was a bombing that hoped to bring down the World Trade Centers, but does not, although it does kill 6 and lead to millions of dollars in damage. In 1996, there was actually a failed attempt to assassinate President Clinton in the Philippines, which came out much later in a book. They had planned to plant a bomb under a bridge that he would have traveled over, but that plan is found out kind of at the last minute. In 1998, there are bombings at U.S. embassies in Tanzania and Kenya, which lead to the deaths of over 200 people. And then a major attack in 2000 on a U.S. ship, the USS Cole, which you see pictured here, that killed 17 people in Yemen. And this was kind of a major attack. It was one of the most visible, these last two were some of the most visible attacks. But still, the idea that Al-Qaeda could attack the United States at home was still seen kind of as unrealistic until September 11th in 2001. Now, this is a tough subject for, I think, any of your teachers to cover objectively, given that it is probably the defining moment of my generation, certainly, and possibly of the U.S. since the end of the Cold War. On September 11th, 19 members of Al-Qaeda hijacked 4 airplanes and carried out an attack on New York and Washington, D.C. 2 planes collided with the World Trade Center towers, which you see there at the top. 1 plane was flown into the Pentagon, which is where the U.S. Department of Defense is located. And another plane, which was believed to be headed for the White House, ended up crashing in a field in Pennsylvania as the passengers on that jet basically took control and flew it into the ground to prevent the attack. Overall, about almost 3,000 people are killed in these terrorist attacks, and well over 6,000 more are injured. In response to these attacks, which have kind of come to define the last 15 years of our history, the United States enacted greater anti-terrorism legislation, for example, the Patriot Act, and they've also launched wars in Afghanistan and Iraq as part of a greater war on terror. And that's what we're going to look at next. In 2001, the United States launched their war in Afghanistan. The goal of this war was to remove an organization known as the Taliban, a fundamentalist Islamic government, which was in power in Afghanistan. It was hopefully to remove them from power because this government had been harboring members of Al-Qaeda, including Osama bin Laden. Like the USSR before, the United States has had a very difficult time fighting in this mountainous terrain of Afghanistan, and there have been both major victories and major setbacks. Given that this war is still ongoing, it makes it the longest war in the history of the United States. And you see some of the scenes from that war in a collage at the top on the right. And the war in Afghanistan, it's very difficult to gauge its success, of course, because the United States has not fully withdrawn, although plans for that are in the works. But probably the even more controversial war that has occurred in this millennium is the Second Persian Gulf War, or the Second Iraq War, or the War in Iraq, or whatever we want to call it. History has not quite yet come down on one term. In 2003, the United States government decided to launch an attack against Saddam Hussein in Iraq. Now you wonder, why does the United States, if we were attacked on September 11th and we know that those people were in Afghanistan, how then do we launch a war in Iraq? Well, the rationale was based on beliefs that Iraq had supported Al-Qaeda and possessed weapons of mass destruction. And this came from intelligence from the CIA and FBI. But ultimately, it has been determined that no weapons of mass destruction were found in Iraq. And so, even though this invasion is successful and Hussein was forced from power and captured and eventually put on trial and put to death, the United States was still mired in a long war against insurgents there and rebels and people who were against the imperialism of the United States. That war lasted all the way until 2011, where it has technically come to an end, although the presence of ISIS in the region has forced the United States to maintain a presence in that region of the world. And part of this presence is really to deal with this global war on terror, which was a term that George W. Bush used to describe the use of the U.S. military and all our capabilities to fight terrorists around the world. Of course, the idea of calling this a war is problematic due to the scale and uncertainty that we have of not only fighting a war against people that are not part of a country, but not knowing where these are, etc. Since it's ongoing, it's tough to judge the effectiveness. Although many terror plots have been thwarted, there have been many successful terror plots during this war. It has cost the United States, in some ways, a lot of respect of the world. In other ways, it has protected many countries around the world. It also has led to a lot of debates whether or not it is legal or ethical of the United States to carry out attacks in foreign nations. One example of this is in May of 2011, the United States sent in Navy SEALs to the compound that you see here at the top, where Osama bin Laden was holed up in Pakistan. And the United States basically goes into Pakistan, carries out the killing of Osama bin Laden, and leaves. But in doing so, basically violates the sovereignty of Pakistan by invading. Also, other points of ethical debate are the use of unmanned drones, which are just these aircraft that are basically flown from a remote location and carry out rocket strikes or bombings of suspected terror targets. And so we haven't come down necessarily on the side of whether this is right or not. This is something currently being debated, and it's out there, and we're still trying to figure everything out. Today, the global war on terror has expanded to include many different terrorist organizations. Currently, the Islamic State, or ISIS, or ISIL, you may hear them called, is the top priority of the United States, especially as they have quite a presence in Iraq and Syria momentarily. And then there are also terrorist groups we're finding popping up in East Africa and popping up in places like Nigeria with Boko Haram. And the question of whether this war is a winnable war against terrorism in our world today is definitely up in the air. Some people would say yes, and others would certainly say no. But we do know that as a result of the war, the United States has continued to stretch its authority to monitor suspected terrorists and its own citizens. And so this has been another thing that's thrown in there. And your opinion on this might depend on your political party. For example, here, the ACLU, or American Civil Liberties Union, which is a very liberal organization, sees the Patriot Act certainly as a violation of freedom, and which has come. Some of the violations of civil liberties have come to light with the revelations released by Eric Snowden that the United States has been monitoring phone calls of citizens. And so this leads to many more questions than maybe I can answer in this video. Certainly, though, keeping in mind that we have reached the present time, the future is uncertain, and the end, though, is not necessarily in sight. How long this war will last, or how long the United States will be a leader in this, or how long we can keep up our place in leading the world in this, is all up for debate, a debate that might be worth having in class. That's all for today. I'll go back to your video goals. Make sure you can answer these questions, and have a good one.